I swear this month is cursed or something. Anyway, welcome to this episode of MTG Arena Run. Today we're doing top 10 most confusing mechanics. This one originally was a very big episode. I even had questions to check how much you actually knew these mechanics and whatnot, but I don't know if it's XSplit or LibreOffice or my graphics card or my setup or whatnot, but it just kept crashing every time I would get to number 4 or number 3. So unfortunately for YouTube, we're getting the abridged version. I'm basically going to talk over the mechanics very quickly. If you want to take a look at the original version, I'll be putting that up in Google Drive, so you can look over the test questions there, see if you can get it or not. But otherwise, most of the other slides are still in. The regular slides are still intact, and so here we're going to be talking about basically we're going to be focusing on different mechanics per se. We're basically abilities and whatnot. So we're not going to be focusing on the stack, though some parts might be relevant to it. We won't be focusing on permissions. We won't be focusing on state-based actions. Now, we won't be talking about these in general, but some of the items here might reference one or another item in one way or another. But those won't necessarily be the reasons why the confusion's there. So it's not exactly the fault of the rules for the most part. So here you go. Number 10, flanking. So the cards I will illustrate is how I remember it. So for those who can't read the reminder text, flanking is whenever a creature without flanking is assigned to block this creature, the blocking creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So many small indicators here that cause issues. One, there's a caveat to this ability. Flanking does nothing if the blocker also has flanking. Most people actually glossed over this one. And it became an inside joke of, oh, nobody reads the reminder text, only to actually to read the reminder text. So that's one part that got glossed over. Another part that got glossed over was that flanking is actually a triggered ability. So for starters, we have an ability that stacks. A creature with 2 instances of flanking, for example, would actually give -1/-1 twice. And this actually came to head in Time Spiral block when we got Sidewinder Sliver. All slivers have flanking. And it was a common too, so imagine drafts where they got 2-3 copies of Sidewinder Sliver. Combat was impossible if you understood it, but at least you wouldn't be throwing creatures away trying to take them down that way. And it's actually an illustration of what these abilities will have in common. Usually abilities that kind of stack on top of each other are not exactly great examples of easily understood abilities. That's kind of why we've done away with prowess. That's why the abilities with weird numbers like Bushido 2, Bushido 1, they a little bit out of favor also because that one also stacked in a very weird way as well. And basically having so many triggers, I guess it's part of the digital age. Every trigger has the potential to be responded to. People complain when we skip trigger, when we let them triggers auto resolve. People complain when we have to go through every trigger. Nobody's happy. So there we go. But otherwise, flanking by itself is an okay, very flavorful ability. It's not a bad ability. It's just there's just some nuance to it. That's why it's down here in number 10. Number 9, Indestructible. Now, most people understand Indestructible. Destroy effects and lethal damage don't destroy it. But most of the confusion pretty much comes from, again, I said I wouldn't be covering Rule 704, but there's some misunderstanding of that one because of how we illustrate damage and toughness reducing effects. So the issue was that we don't get this issue in Magic the Gathering Online because what the game would do is they would have the power and toughness down here on the lower right corner. Right above it would be a red circle with a white number. That would be how much damage was marked on that creature. So it would be clear what the power and toughness is, what the actual damage marked is. Both of them are different. If we play MTG Arena, for example, they just smash the two together. So it creates the illusion that damage reduces toughness. And if you're coming from, say, Hearthstone, that's normal. That's fine because that's how the mechanic worked. It doesn't. Nope. It doesn't work here in Magic. So that's usually the one question complaint that's always appears in the forums. But there's actually a little bit of history here. One way to take care of one way to also take care of such said creature that's indestructible is to have it lose the ability indestructible all of a sudden. That's why we also now get questions. Hey, I have a god that's active. How did it die? Did you see the Shadow Spear? Usually that's the case. But once upon a time, Shadow Spear's activated ability would have been impossible. That was because back then, Indestructible was basically a rule state. It was not an ability that you can gain or lose. Well, technically, you could gain the ability. It gives the ability, but it just modifies the rules on that one. But it's not an ability that could be taken away. It's a very minor nuance, but most people were playing it incorrectly, so they had to change it so that what was intuition was correct. Indestructible just became an ability. So you could see the two versions of Darksteel Ingot here as an example. But otherwise, what would happen was, if it gained Indestructible, it would not lose Indestructible until the effect itself ended. Kind of weird, but that was how it worked back then. So there was quite a bit more confusion. Thankfully, we just fixed that rule. It was much better. So number 9, Indestructible. Number 8, Fading. I probably should have put the illustration of Vanishing here as well, but here's what Fading was. So this permanent will come into play with X number of fade counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a fade counter from it. If you can't, sacrifice it. Now the reason this was a really confusing mechanic was you had to keep track of something every upkeep, but the most intuitive time when you're supposed to sacrifice it was not the time you sacrificed it. You did not sacrifice it when the last counter was removed. You sacrificed it on the next upkeep when you could not remove a counter. And what happened in actual gameplay was there would be some cases where you'd remove the last fade counter, something complicated happens during that turn. Your opponent has his turn, something complicated happens or whatnot, takes some time. When you come to your turn, you forget about taking care of you forget about, oh, I have to sacrifice this creature because there's no counters there to remind you that this had fading. Most people would gloss over the fact that it had fading unless there were counters on it. So they did fix this mechanic up in Planar Chaos. Fading would become Vanishing. The simple tweak was that the counters were removed on upkeep. That was a separate trigger. But the trigger was now, when the last counter was removed, you sacrifice it. It was a one-time check. So if you somehow were able to counter that trigger or prevent the sacrifice, congratulations, you don't have to bother with it again. So there was no problem having that permanent. With the original one, you'd have to it will actually keep checking every upkeep. Another case of a lot of triggers going into the stack and whatnot, a lot of bookkeeping. Sure, Magic is a complicated game, but we don't need to make it an accounting game also. So there you go. Number 8, Fading. So Vanishing kind of replaces that. Number 7, Suspend. Speaking of time spiral block and complicated mechanics. So here's how this one worked. Normally, in the case of Errant Ephemeron, I'd be paying 7 mana for a 4/4 flyer. Then it would have Summoning Sickness. I would attack the turn after that. Here, instead, for the low price of 2 mana, 1 in a blue, I can from my hand, I can exile it with a certain number of time counters on it. In this case, 4. At the beginning of my upkeep, I'd remove a time counter. When I remove the last time counter, I can cast the spell without paying its mana cost. So this one was a very easily understood mechanic in terms of explaining. It's like, oh, you're just trading time for mana. So it's like saying the 5 mana is worth 4 turns, and it's usually true in that sense. So where did the confusion come from? Remember Fading? There was confusion about tracking removing counters from creatures on the battlefield. Here, you're tracking counters on a zone you're not supposed to be paying attention to. This was back when it was removed from the game. So you have to remove counters there. Then you have to remember that the creature had a haste bonus. Actually, that was not a problem. I'll get back to that one later. but there's also many timing interactions. The act of removing a counter, putting the spell on the stack, those are triggered abilities in themselves. So there are a lot of ways to actually mess this up if you had access to enough history of magic cards. And it was a fairly complex mechanic at that. What highlighted this one was the pros loved this mechanic. This was a very easily understood mechanic for tournament play. The pros enjoyed it. Casual players, not so much. This was not the only factor. Suspend by itself was not at fault. There were many other factors. But it was a contributing factor. Basically, what happened was tournaments were at an all-time high. Casual play, tracked by sales of product, was significantly low. And it was actually a result of this that we started going towards the push of mechanics that are easily understood, but not at this level of wordy complexity. Well, that kind of changed. We're now on the opposite end of the pendulum now, but I guess we'll get to that when we get to a certain mechanic. It's coming up soon. But between all those factors, Suspend is considered a very complex mechanic. Oh yeah, speaking of the remembering it has haste, it was the opposite problem. The original design for this card, it did not give the creature haste. If you check out the GDC YouTube channel, you'd see all the past GDC talks. Mark Rosewater gave a talk on different lessons he learned in the history of making Magic. And the interesting thing about this one, so from his story, original one, whenever the last time counter is put off, they cast a spell for free, they attacked with it immediately. It was a case of everyone was reading to it that it had haste, even if it did not have haste. That led to the simple solution. Okay, let's just give it haste. So again, it's a case of complexity because that's how people played it. Now, it took a majority of people to play it that way. I'm not saying that just because you misunderstood the mechanic, that doesn't mean that everyone else misunderstands the mechanic. No, there are many people. Sometimes it could be just you, but it's not necessarily that the part is at fault. That said, Suspend is kind of complicated for all the other reasons as well. So that's number 7, Suspend. Number 6, Legendary. Now, this one, very confusing if I asked you what was the legend rule at this year. We've had different iterations of the legend rule. We've had different iterations of the Planeswalker rule before it got merged into the legend rule. Like if I was to talk about ancient history, did you know when legends first appear in the set Legends that you could only have one copy of a legendary card in your deck? They were all pre-restricted in a sense. I think this was before the banned and restricted list per se. So there's an interesting rules quirk from history. That one quickly disappeared though. But otherwise, when you get people playing Magic now and you get people playing from way back before, sometimes people would remember the rules differently. This was usually the case of how this confusion would come about. There's also one other item that caused some confusion. But this one's really more of how we explain the mechanic. Usually when we try to explain something, we want to explain it in as few words as possible, or we try to use existing jargon as possible. The most common explanation that I've heard and I've read in forums is that, if there are multiple copies of one legend, you have to choose one and sacrifice the rest. That's technically not correct. It's choose one, the rest go to the graveyard as state-based action. It kind of feels like a sacrifice. It certainly looks like a sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice. If I had the Mayhem Devil there, the Mayhem Devil would not trigger. So it's a case of where Legendary becomes complex only because of how we explain it. That it's a case of where the friends we have, and let's be honest, most of us learn Magic from our friends. It's only, I'd say, very recently that we started learning Magic from playing computer iterations, and even then we still had to learn from other people as well. But otherwise, there we go. That's number 6, legendary. And I didn't even covered how the rules change in so many ways. Basically, there was one version was first come first serve. There was one version where if there were multiple copies, they all imploded. Then we have the version that we have now. Probably the best version, depending on who you ask. Some people might prefer the version where all the legendaries and planeswalkers can just implode together and die. But that's how they feel. Number 6, legendary. There's a source of confusion there. Number 5, Soulbond. Oh my, this is also another source of confusion. Now, Soulbond, here's the reminder text. You may pair this creature with another paired creature when either enter the battlefield. They remain paired for as long as you control both of them. So, many questions here. 1, it's not a target effect. That's clear in the reminder text. But 2, it's a trigger that works both ways. Now, when I first attended pre-release, I talked with some of the judges before the event started about Soulbond because actually more of my neighbor then was a judge at the event, so I came together with him. We had to go there very early so I helped set up stuff and whatnot. So I was asking them about how I was asking them if they checked up on Soulbond. Most of them did not realize that it worked the other way around. Like, most of them expected that, it works that if you have a creature there and you play the Soulbond creature. They did not expect that you have a Soulbond creature, then you play a creature. That was until the guy who actually printed the release notes came. So back in the days, release notes came a little bit later. If I remember correctly, that time I read the release notes like the night before the pre-release. That was when it came out. So there was that one bit. Another bit was because that all of these pairings and unpairings are triggered abilities. We get many weird cases that can happen as a result. Like, there's an interesting case, like, if I were to generate multiple tokens, it is actually possible to pair with all of those tokens. Well, not at the same time, but let's say I had the Nightshade Peddler. That one, when it pairs with another creature, each of those creatures get Death Touch. If I pair it in a way that I'm able to have the token fight one of my opponent's creatures, since it'll have Death Touch, it'll probably kill my opponent's creature. If the token's like a 1/1, my token will probably die. Then the next trigger will come up, and I can pair it again. And if I have a way to get the fight going again, I can get it again. It's kind of like a machine gun effect that could happen. So a lot of weird board states. Again, another case of when having so many triggers will actually make a mechanic complex. Then there's also the onboard complexity. You have to pay attention to how these creatures are. Find a way to match which one is bonded together. You don't want to exactly put one on top of the other. You're going to kind of forget. And there's also the complexity, like if it's a Soulbond creature and another Soulbond creature, and you have to pay attention to what those abilities are. Like, I remember back in the pre-release, both me and my opponent misplayed one Soulbond creature. I thought it gave each, wherein if you're not careful with reading the cards carefully, you will misunderstand the abilities. Like, it didn't help the Tandem Lookout and the one that drew, and the one that gave Flying. Both of them had the same pose, and they're both blue, and they both had the same mana cost. Well, that's another story. But yeah, a lot. It's a problem when there's some Soulbond has an interesting implementation, but there's still quite a good amount of complexity. So that's number 5, Soulbond. Number 4, protection. And I'm showing you an example without any reminder text because back in the day, this was how we saw the card. And actually, back in the day, protection was not clearly defined either. It was simply defined as, cards cannot be affected by cards of the certain quality. So once upon a time, it was, depending on how you played, or which group you played with, it was possible that Wrath of God, a white board wipe, will not destroy a black knight with protection from white. It was only until 6th edition that they clearly codified what protection was. It was back in the back in the wild wild west days of Magic, when the rules were very loosey goosey and all that, and it's only now when we've had them clearly defined. And even then, people who played, most of them don't know that there's the acronym DEP, that there are four actual pieces to protection. That's why we get questions like, how how come my creature was able to die, because there was an effect that meant damage could not be prevented and whatnot. So there's a and Questing Beast of recent, Questing Beast and Stomp are the two number one culprits for that one. There's also the case of what my why did my enchantment fall off? That's another protection thing as well. There's again a protection's ability that has four different abilities. Can't be damaged, can't be enchanted or equipped, can't be blocked, can't be targeted, and that's just the short form of it. So that's kind of why it's apropos. It's number 4 on the most complicated one. It's in fact, for quite some time, like 6th edition to 9th edition, there was no protection there. And even in recent core sets, we've only returned protection as a full ability recently. Even before that, we've had different versions of, like, we're just taking individual elements of this. Like, remember Dominaria? It was hexproof from black, hexproof from white. It was just limited to the can't be targeted part. Or there's even older cards back then, like, can't be damaged by blue or black sources, etc. Something like that. But there you go, number 4, protection. Still very confusing. Number 3, we have phasing here. So and I'm not cheating here. This was the card I remembered. It's a rare, yes, but back in the day, phasing had no reminder text at all. If you can search the old cards, none of them would have reminder text. So there would be so many questions about this, like, when exactly did it phase out and phase in? Everybody assumed it was upkeep, so there would be weird timing shenanigans and whatnot. Then this was also more or less the time when we started introducing enter the battlefield triggers. Back in Ice Age, it was, when something when you do this, the trigger would happen next upkeep. That one was even more confusing. But here we have enter the battlefield triggers, and the number one confusion was, does phasing take it out of the battlefield and put it back in the battlefield? The short answer is no. It's a very clear answer now. But back then when rules discussion was friends among friends, we didn't it was codified, but it's not the huge law book that it is today. There was quite a bit of confusion. In fact, if in terms of modern interpretation, we only have one modern card, Teferi's Protection, and it's not repeatable phasing. It's just a one-shot phases out. So personally, for me, this was the time I actually kind of dropped out of Magic, because I got tired of explaining and debating on how phasing worked. This was probably the height of rules complexity for me back in the day. But thankfully, there is a more modern explanation. Basically, phasing is, you just pretend that the permanent is not there. Can't see it. And when it's back to your upkeep, you can see it again. John Cena, go away. But there you go. Number 3, phasing. Number 2, mutate. Actually, originally I had this setup where I would ask questions for each of this. For number 2, mutate, I figured I'm not asking questions for this anymore. There are just way too many questions. In fact, if you read the recent article from the Mothership by Mark Rosewater, they were saying that Ikoria is part of an experiment of trying to push the boundaries of complexity. Like, if a mechanic is flavorful enough, can it carry a certain amount of complexity? And I will agree that mutate is a very flavorful mechanic, but there are certain rules interactions, mostly with very old cards, that require a lot to be asked. So actually, I'm thankful that this was a new initiative. Basically, what happened was, when prior to when Ikoria more or less came out, when the mechanics were announced, they also announced an AMA. So a lot of people posted a lot of questions. It says Ikoria rules and mechanics, but the questions were pretty much 90% about mutate, and a lot of the things I only numbered this at number 2. I rated it high because of its how recent it is, but also because in terms of precedence, the closest thing we had to this were the meld cards. Actually, if you think of it, what would happen to a meld card and a mutate pile is pretty much the same. But there are still some interesting interactions also, that we now have an entire section of the rules, section 721, purely detailing about just about mutate, and they actually label it as merging with permanent. So it's right now just one keyword causes an object to merge with a permanent, but I would not be surprised that if we might see this in the future. And I wouldn't be too unhappy with that. Sure, right now it's very complex. I don't expect to see this complexity go away, but but I guess it's up to you how you see it. So there you go. But definitely mutate is very high in the complexity list. I would put it at number 2. And number 1, banding. Again, we would not get reminder text until Ice Age, and even then the reminder text was very sketchy at best. In fact, no, I don't think we got reminder text at all. We only got reminder text way after banding was not used. And don't get me started with bands with others. That's also here. In fact, that could probably be number 0. So why is this very confusing? Well, for starters, if I ask multiple people to explain banding, they will get the gist of it, but they will miss out certain parts. Number 1 that's missed out, there is banding on defense. Everyone knows banding as you can band an attack, like there's one creature and every other creature is banding. They all attack together as a band. But what they don't know is on defense, because everyone just thinks, oh, you can block together, that's fine. But if one of those creatures had banding, the defender gets to distribute damage, not the attacker. Another source of confusion is, especially with our modern rules now. Back in the day, you could it was normal for the attacker to distribute damage to the defender. Defender distributes damage. It was actually an interesting trick back in the day. Let's say I attacked with a 4/4. My opponent blocked with 2 3/3 creatures. If I know I have a cheap board wipe, like say a Pyroclasm, modern equivalent now is Flame Sweep. If I could distribute the damage, it wouldn't kill both of them immediately, but the subsequent spell will. Actually, in that example, the Pyroclasm would still kill it. Let's say I attack with the 4/4. My opponent blocks with 2 4/4s. There. Then I can just distribute 2 damage each. Then I can use a limited board wipe, like a Cry of the Carnarium, for example. So there's some also confusion with how modern blocking rules would affect the banding rule. The answer is that you forget the modern banding rules when banding is modern damage assignment rules when banding is involved. You go back to the old one, and we go to bands with other, which changes the limitations of who can band with who. And if you go listen to the podcast of Mark Rosewater about banding, when they started having the first few tournaments, majority of questions were, how does banding work exactly? And it will always be questions about banding. It was a mechanic that was flavorful. It's easy to understand. But the moment you get into a tournament setting where you're not playing with your friends and you can't just come to a consensus of how it works, you need an authoritative answer to how it works. And when everyone is understood it to work differently, that's where we get confusion. Nowadays, I will not expect something of the level of banding today. If you remember, protection is multiple abilities at once. Here, it's multiple things to consider just on attack and defense alone. So there we go. Number 1, banding. And you can add bands with others with that one. So there we go. That's it for this episode. If you want to see the actual questions I've had for this one, I'm gonna set up a Google Docs link for the original presentation. You can check the questions out I have there. Also, do check out some of I'll try to put as many links as I can to some of the sources I cited. And we'll probably have something a lot simpler. I do have another idea in mind. But anyway, that's it for this episode of MTG Arena Run Top 10. If you have any comments of for what you would like to see in another top 10, or what do you feel is a mechanic that's confusing for you that's not here, do let me know in the comments. Shout out to Magic the Gathering Armory, the Facebook group. I basically post this question to them. A good number of suggestions that I did not consider came from there, and so thank you guys for answering that poll. And until then, stay safe wherever you are. Take care. God bless. Have a great day, everyone. Hope to see you again next month. Take care. See you soon.